some way, I hope that what I have to say is of use and interest to you, and another part of me hopes that this is nothing new and you all agree with me. We'll see how it goes. I should probably start off by saying that I may be a little harsh with some people. And I don't intend to be. I want it to be kind of just constructive criticism. Also, if you're concerned, you don't have to worry. Yes, my nose is very big, but nothing happened to it. I'm just Jewish, so it's okay. You don't have to worry. It'll be fine. I just wanted to say what organizations I've worked in and where my academic work is in. So kind of get to know me a little better. In Los Angeles, I was part of several groups, including Progressive Alliance, the Los Angeles Collective Network, Stop the War of the World Coalition, Students for Social Change, the Los Angeles chapter of Southern California Anarchist Federation. Then in Berkeley, where I did my undergrad, I was in Berkeley Cop Watch, and then I'm doing my the master's and PhD in the UK, where I was part of the student movement. We had a student occupation, part of the anti-cuts movement, and also a member of the teachers UC. Academically, I study social movements from a sociological, political science perspective. It's quite interdisciplinary in a way, but it's rooted in what sometimes called the subdiscipline of social movements or social movement theory. I study lots of different things, but I'm also a co-chair of INSPIRE, which is the Interdisciplinary Network for Social Protest, and the co-editor of Contention, which is the multidisciplinary journal of social protest. So that's where I'm from, and I want to talk to you about social movements against neoliberalism. We should probably begin with kind of unpacking these terms a little bit. I know you guys know what neoliberalism is, so we're not going to go into it that much. But I wanted to say that it's partially an ideology in that it's a set of beliefs. It's not only that, but that's part of it. And it threatens to be an ideology in another sense. Right? It threatens to be an ideology in the sense that we see no alternative to it, where it becomes something we take for granted. That neoliberalism is the only system, and so in a way you would imagine kind of the idea of there is no alternative, or TINA as it's referred to, almost disappearing. Because if you have TINA, if you have the idea that there is no alternative, in a way you're still thinking about the possibility of an alternative. There's a serious threat for neoliberalism to become this form of ideology. Now there's threats to neoliberalism. One of them, I think, is the crisis. I think purely from kind of a market rationalist perspective, there's a problem. It's an ideology that's not necessarily good for all capitalist productivity. I think if you keep having cuts, in some places will grow, in other places you just won't have growth. And so the crisis can be a way to actually get rid of neoliberalism, at least moving it to something not as bad, but it certainly doesn't look like it's going to turn it into something great. And of course we have social movements, which is really what it's all about. So you have social movements that are opposed to neoliberalism. And that's what we want to talk about. So what is a social movement? Part of the literature, and of course in any kind of discipline you have disagreements over definitions. But one definition is looking at a social movement as organizations, groups, individuals that are networked together. They're networked together for something, in opposition to something, or for a general direction in something. Very rarely will you have a movement in which you have a wide variety of organizations and individuals working together that have the exact same vision, the exact same strategy, the exact same goal. Generally, it's towards a direction that you want to move things to, or it could be strictly in opposition to one thing or another. So you have this movement, and part of what I want to say applies to movements against neoliberalism. But part of it is about how movements are shaped by neoliberalism in a way. So what kind of aspects of the movement do we have? We have socialist parties, we have prefigurative localized groups, we have single-issue organizations, we have exiters, and we have events. So I'll unpack some of these as well. Socialist parties, you kind of have two parts of those. Often it depends on what we like to call the political opportunity structure. So in America, as you guys know, it's a two-party system. Very rarely can you get a third party in there, and it tends to be ineffective. The most effect that it has is pushing one party to take up a position or not, rather than actually winning some kind of election. So you have different types of socialist parties. Some of them are proper parties, which you can vote and try to get into government in one way or another, and others are essentially act like social movement organizations of another kind, but consider themselves or call themselves socialist parties, communist parties, or things like that. Prefigurative localized groups. Prefigurative, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure most of you do, but it just means kind of that it embodies what it likes to see in the broader world. So things like, if we believe in participatory democracy being as part of the system that we want to see in the world, our movement has to have that also. A lot of the times we take for granted things like our movement is opposed to sexism and racism, but in some ways that's a prefigurative politic, right? Then you have single-issue organizations, self-explanatory, basically, organizations that are working on a very particular goal, one issue. That could be part of the broader movement, so it's connected in some way. Exiters, so that's basically taking yourself out of the system as a form of protest, and it could be also connected with all of these things. And events, and by that I don't mean anything complicated, mostly like protest events, occupations, in which you get individuals who can come and participate, who otherwise wouldn't be networked or connected to these groups outside of those events. So you have these things, and they're kind of intertwined. They don't necessarily have to be just one of them, right? And this makes up our social movements. And if I missed anything, I'm sure you guys know. But I wanted to take that and say that now in this movement that we have globally, and I don't know that much about your movement. I've heard lots of different things, and I don't know that much about the politics and social movements in Slovenia. But so hopefully during questions you guys can say if this resonates at all with you. But from my research and my experience, it seems like exiters and prefigurative localized groups are growing. That's becoming more mainstream, and you're having less of the other forms. And I want to kind of talk about how that process started, or how that has occurred. And there's no one answer. Obviously, lots of things are interacting, and different contexts produce different types of movements. One thing I think, though, is you have a type of collective cognitive dissonance, which is really when you hold something, you believe in something, and you have this new information that comes in, and it's antagonistic to what you hold as a belief. And it can shake you a bit, and it can drive change, but mostly in terms of psychologically, it often makes you just accept what you've already been believing beforehand. But the way that I want to talk about this is to give an example about the New Left. So the New Left grew out of the Old Left. The Old Left was about labor movements. It was about materialist concerns. It didn't talk about identity politics. It didn't talk about democracy. It talked about those economic issues. And part of the reason why we moved into the New Left was that at the time, the Soviet Union, which was the model of this kind of old left politic, right? You had the revolution, it was going somewhere, and obviously you have critiques from various sides saying, well, it wasn't exactly what it was supposed to be, and it wasn't at the height of capitalism, so it was meant to fail based on Marxist principles, etc., etc. But in some ways, you still had it as this vision, and it was, even if it wasn't the right vision, it gave us something to work off of. But at the time of the New Left, you had more and more information coming out that actually the Soviet Union was worse and worse than we thought. A lot of anarchists, of course, were hopeful that it would turn into something great, even when they were kind of skeptical about the whole project, but there was hope. But the more you learned about it, the more concerned you became with this project. And so you started to develop a criticism around, well, what didn't happen? What was missing? What were we focusing on that meant that we were wrong beforehand? So we have this belief that this is right, but then we have this example that's showing us maybe we were wrong and we have to change something. So you started developing this politics that incorporated more of things like participatory democracy, right? So, okay, you got rid of capitalism in a way, but you didn't really have people who weren't exploited. You still had a class that exploited another group of people. And so maybe the political system and not just the economic system has to change, and that changing one won't necessarily change the other, and things like that. So you became to develop a new critique of the system and a new perspective, and different forms of social movement organizations grew out of that, that didn't exist before. What happened after the fall of the Soviet Union? Basically, we entered this kind of end of history paradigm, right? You had different theorists talking about this perspective, where the liberal democracy and capitalism were the thing that were gonna, that was the end game. There's nothing else, right? So there's no alternative. This is what it is, the end of history. All of those end of history theorists have pretty much given up hope that there's an end of history. Part of that is because of China, suggesting that there's kind of you can have capitalism and you can have authoritarianism, and that seems to work. And the other example is the ideological one, where you have radical Islamists basically calling for a very kind of old school, primitive almost levels of fascism, right? So end of history arguments are gone. But in terms of the left, I mean, there's still no hope in terms of existing examples for us. So we've entered this idea of there is no alternative. And of course, Zizek says sometimes we often internalize this, and this is part of the problem with the movements. And I want to kind of explore that a bit. So we have this collective cognitive dissonance. Part of our ideology, whatever it may be, if you're anarchist, communist, socialist, progressive, whatever, you believe that things can be better and change significantly from what they are now. And then you have this other thing where actually nothing's worked and there is no alternative. And this kind of idea is kind of creeping in, and we're starting to have to change the way we are perceiving certain things. And it's a dangerous thing is what I want to say with this talk. And I want to explore it a bit. It doesn't have to be this way, but it seems like our movements are going into this direction, where we actually believe in that there is no alternative. And so, what are the kind of things that grow out of this collective cognitive dissonance? I think part of it is dogma. So, if you actually don't, okay, so when I say you don't believe that there's an alternative, I think all of us here think that there's an alternative. But oftentimes, the way it works is that we internalize it in a way that, okay, we are still expressing that there's an alternative, but we don't actually believe what we're saying, right? So what I really mean by believing in an alternative is a serious kind of deep-rooted belief that there is an alternative. And what that can do is cause, one of the things is cause dogma. If you don't believe that there is an alternative, but your ideology says that there is supposed to be an alternative, then what you end up doing is following dogma and basically putting faith in something that you actually don't believe in a deeper way, right? So you're taking something on board and following through with it. Another thing that can happen is lifestyleism. Okay, we don't believe that there's an alternative, but at least we can play the part. We can play the part of what was done before, and this is the kind of stuff that Bookchin talks about, right? So, falling from authenticity, reactionary romanticism, and we see it in all sorts of movements, including social anarchism. So it's not just like an individualist anarchist perspective or thing that happens within those groups. People kind of take on a persona and stick with what they believe to be authentic. And even the postmodernists who have a critique of authenticity, they don't believe in something that's authentic, can oftentimes still have this lifestylist politics that exists. And all you really need for lifestyleism to happen is to have something that's lasted a period of time and, you know, someone to emulate, really. It's nothing special. Another thing that could happen if we take on the belief that there is no alternative is we just argue for purity, for individual purity. So there is no alternative. What can we do? At least let's not do something that we get blamed for causing problems, right? The world's not going to get better in any significant way. There's nothing we can do about it, but at least I won't participate. I won't compromise. I won't participate in politics. I won't participate in capitalism, and I won't sin, basically, right? And then there's self-development, which is, okay, there's no alternative, but at least we can build a movement that helps me feel better, that helps build happy communities, that empowers us. So, one second. And there's also this thing of hypercriticism. So if we don't believe in an alternative, but our ideology says we should believe in an alternative, we can just go on this rant of being hypercritical about every active thing that we could do. And it could be another problem in our movement. So one way to look at this is to see how all of these things would gauge success. What would it mean to be successful in these movements if you're thinking in these ways? So it would be things like you strictly follow the dogma. You are authentic, as authentic as possible. You're as pure as possible. You've developed as much as possible, right? So this would be success. So really, the means and the ends, in a way, are really close together, if not the same. The goal is the act in itself. And you can see this, in some ways, in certain elements of the movements that we have that are relatively new. So things like consensus, things like festive protests, and community building internally within movements. So what's the difference? If we talk about success in that way, as basically a process, if you actually believe there is an alternative, even if you keep all of those elements, all of these new aspects of our movements, all of these things, if you believe that there is an alternative, it actually changes the equation significantly. Because you no longer would judge things based on how authentic you're being, but how effective they are at reaching your alternative, right? So if we take the example from the New Left, which was also perceive this concept? Well, they saw it as a means, for one, to grow the movement. People want to be involved. People want to contribute. And in hierarchical organizations, you often don't get a chance to. Also, this grew out directly out of problems that you had with gender divisions, even within early New Left politics, where women were basically cast aside to do menial jobs and really boring work, and not serious political work, or if that's how we want to perceive that type of work. Also, participatory democracy was used to show that the example that it's leading the example, right? We're creating what we want to see in the world, so we're being prefigurative in that way. But we want to show people that it can work. So that's the real aim of consensus. So if consensus doesn't work in the New Left movements, then maybe you have altered consensus. Maybe you have contexts in which consensus works, or contexts in which majority voting works, or major majority voting, right? That kind of stuff. So it doesn't become a strict thing that we rely on. It becomes something that's dependent on whether it's producing the outcomes that we want to achieve with it. Festive Protest is quite similar. It could be used to bring in more people. It's a certain type of people, perhaps, that want to participate in those kind of protests. But it's helpful to bring those people in. And it could sustain activism, which can be quite difficult to do. And if you actually have a festive protest that makes you be able to be more energetic, then you can be better at doing the rest of the activism that you're doing, which can take a toll on you, right? And then you get all of this burnout, which happens to everyone, right? So then we're again looking at it at a different perspective. So it's not festive protest because this is somehow the revolution in itself, but festive protest as a means to draw more people in. And if it's not doing that, well, we should change it because it's not functioning to reach our alternative. And then you have this with labels. You have it with labels all the time. I consider myself an anarchist, but I often say that I'm an anarchist when I talk to other radical people. Very rarely would I say I'm an anarchist when I'm talking to normal people. Because the label shouldn't be something that you use as a means in itself, right? As an ends in itself. We don't want to just be anarchists or be communists or be socialists. We want to have a vision, an alternative. And you have countries that do the opposite of what we do, right? You have totalitarian, terrible countries calling themselves the Democratic Republic of so-and-so. We do the opposite. We take a good idea and we use a name for it that most people see as something terrible, destructive, it hasn't worked, it's caused so many problems. And so we often kind of are shooting ourselves in the foot when we do these things. And my argument is that we're doing these things sometimes for other reasons. And part of that is because we don't believe that there is an alternative, so we don't really fight for it. We fight for those other reasons. Lifestyleism, dogma, etc., etc. So there's this kind of threat to transition completely from this new left model, where we still believe in an alternative, but it's a different view from the old left, to the post-left, right, where we're apolitical. We don't think that anything's going to change, so why don't we just change ourselves and the kind of the behavior that we engage in. So let's move on to why we might not think that there's an alternative. And I don't have any fancy labels for these things, but I don't think we necessarily need it either. I think we can be quite open about it. I think at some point, some of us might just not give a shit. We don't care to build an alternative. We don't care to find one. We don't care to believe in one. We're here for other reasons. Maybe there's kind of like a competitive advantage to identity, and all the good ones were taken, so we became activists, and we can have some organic popcorn and just like watch the show or whatever. Let's hope that that's not why we're here, but maybe some of us are activists for reasons not of building an alternative, right? Maybe we're lazy. Maybe we're not working hard enough to construct an alternative vision that we actually believe in. And maybe we're scared to do that. So how do we envision this development? I think because it's this deep-rooted belief, it doesn't necessarily have to be a complete vision. We don't have to see the end game. We don't have to see the whole thing. So Chomsky talks about this. He doesn't think that you should develop this strategy of seeing what the end thing is. But you can still believe in an alternative. And his good friend, Michael Albert, I don't know, are you guys aware of Michael Albert at all? Paracon? Yeah. So there's this idea. Michael Albert's a good friend of Chomsky. He studied under him at MIT, and he was part of the New Left. He did develop this idea called participatory economics, participatory society, and it really kind of, it might be the best example. I mean, it's not perfect, and he doesn't say that it is, but it's the best example of a fully kind of structured view of what a functioning alternative would look like. At least for those of you who believe in a system without any economy and we all doing things for the greater good, at least an interim kind of halfway mark to that alternative. And they're good friends, and he believes that we need to have this. And there's some good reasons to believe that we need to have this, because this vision, this kind of written out vision, because you want people who come not from our perspective to see that there is an alternative, right? So there's these examples, but we kind of have to look into it, and we kind of have to care. And if we don't care, and if we are lazy, then we there's this threat that we actually empower neoliberalism more than anything else. Neoliberalism, if we don't believe in an alternative, neoliberalism we basically have a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we can't come up with one, it's not going to come up with one for us. So what would an effective movement look like? Well, you have to have that alternative, right? But it's not just that. You have to have some strategy of getting there. Because if you just have that, and you believe in that, you don't necessarily see the progress you're making and the steps that you need to take to get there. We hear this all the time. It becomes an easy excuse in Marxist circles to say that, well, the material conditions just have to change and then we'll get there, and it'll just happen eventually. Because sometimes, for some people, there's no strategy needed. So that's something else that we need. But once you start thinking about strategy, you start thinking about an alternative, you have a goal. And the thinking goes beyond a theoretical level. You still have to have that. But if it goes beyond a theoretical level, and you start thinking about empirical questions, you start thinking about how do we get from here to there? How do we accomplish this interim goal? How do we build our movement? How do we get 10 more people at our meetings? And those questions become empirical. And theories can help you to bring about kind of little experiments about if it's working or not. But to avoid, if we actually believe in an alternative and we want to build it, then we don't stick to a theory just because we like it. That goes back to the dogma part of it, right? We stick to things that work. We test things out. And things aren't going to work the same way always, every time you try it, right? Everything's based on the context. But we have to test things out, and we have to learn. And in a way, this is where my academic focus comes in. And I think that this is a real benefit that academia can bring to social movements in a really real way. Because we can use, as activists, we can use our experiences to develop this understanding of what works, what doesn't, how we get here, how we get there. But you have a whole host of people that say that they're political, that say that they're on the left. They rarely engage with activism, at least from the academics that I know. But they could be very helpful. and actually answering specific questions that are beneficial to activists. So they don't have to necessarily get engaged. We can still kind of use them, to put it not nicely. But we can kind of use them for what they're good for, right? So there's already a quite hefty literature on social movements. The problem with it is it's still academic. It's still really based in this idea of we want to publish journal articles and get jobs. It's unfortunate, but it's true. You have some criticism within that about the theories and the conversations that the academics are having actually being knowledge that activists generally already have. But there is some good stuff there. And sometimes you have to kind of go through a lot of bullshit to find the thing that's useful, which is unfortunate. Certain projects are trying to change that, and there's movement in the direction to actually be helpful directly to social movements. One example is a guy named Felix Cole. He was an activist, and he became an academic. And he talked about mechanisms for outcomes. So understanding how we achieve outcomes. This was about policy issues. So often we don't like to talk about kind of reforming the state or reforming policies or things like that. But eventually, if you think about an alternative, if you have an alternative, if you believe in an alternative, then you're going to have to engage with certain policies, because certain policies are going to, changes in those policies are going to help your movement in the long run, right? So this is what can be known as non-reformist reforms. You reform something in order to help you, in the long run, significantly change society, potentially in a revolutionary way, right? So he's talking about mechanisms. So he's found 5 mechanisms, and he's tested them on different theories, on different movements, by looking at how those movements were able to achieve different goals. So one of the mechanisms is public preference. That's about basically having movements impact public opinion and issue salience, which is basically a fancy term for how important that issue is in the public realm. Right? And by doing this, those social movements then indirectly affect change. So the public opinion will then lead politicians to make certain reforms. Disruption is another one. So this is not about protests that become violent or property destruction, necessarily. Those things might not necessarily be disruptive. Disruption means the mechanism by which we actually stop the government from doing certain things that it wants to do, to the extent where it's willing to grant certain concessions. Political access is another one. This is more about gaining the right to vote for certain demographics, or in some contexts you can say removing the right of others to vote. So Republicans in the US play this game all the time, making certain laws for certain demographics of people so they don't vote, and then the political composition of the Senate and the House of Representatives changes. And then they get their way, policy-wise. There's also the judicial mechanism. So that's basically going through the courts and having that change policy. And the international politics mechanism. And I have a hard time explaining this one without using an example. The civil rights movement used the Soviet Union as a way to show that by being racist in America, we're actually helping the Soviet Union grow in other countries, particularly in Africa. So they used international relations as a means to actually force their concession. So how did these test out? All of them had some level of effectiveness. seems that quite a lot of research shows, sorry, that public preference, the idea that we impact public opinion, is particularly helpful. It ends up being quite effective. They've looked at the anti-nuclear power movement, civil rights movement. Not really true in terms of climate change, but it does work in quite a lot of movements that have been tested using these mechanisms. Disruption, the main proponents of disruption as a means of impacting change are Piven and Cloward. I don't know if anyone's read that. They're a bit older, and they grew out of the poor people movement. So basically looking at the state giving money to poor people. And they've shown, they've had some evidence, which is quite good, showing that disruptive protest was helpful at getting communities to get federal or local funding. The problem with disruptive movements, they argue, is that as soon as you stop being disruptive, all those benefits pretty much go away quite quickly.
What are the names of the authors?
Piven and Cloward.
Piven and what?
Cloward. Cloward. Political access is more specific. It often is much better in places where you don't have a certain demographic who's either that's not voting at all because they can't, or that's underrepresented. So you can have this with young people in most countries because they tend to not vote as much, and they tend to be more left-wing. So you could, by figuring out a way of getting them to kind of participate, shift the political spectrum a little bit, right? And obviously we're not talking about huge shifts most of the time when we're talking about these reforms, which is obviously the sad state of politics. But in a way, these reforms become useful if we think about them strategically for long-term success, right? So I don't want you want to think that this is kind of the end-all and we should only stick to this kind of politics. But it's useful to think about how we could use the system to win what we really want in the long term. And so this is an example of kind of empirical research that's gone in and looked at other cases. It's done the history, and it's found certain things working and certain things not working. The judicial mechanism was looked at in the US, and that was found to be particularly useless in that context. Because what they found was, in terms of the civil rights movement and various other ones, is that public opinion, as soon as that shifted, basically the courts ruled it in the favor of public opinion. So really the mechanism there was, again, public preference. Okay. So that's just examples, and obviously in different contexts it might be different. So it's not like a law, but it helps us to learn what we can do and figure out strategies of approaching to make sure that we get the alternative that we actually want, if we want it, which is the first step, of course. So in terms of academia, I think obviously if we want to get involved in academia, there's a place for us to develop the alternative. There's a place for us to develop the strategy of how to get there. And there's also a place for us to really develop the understanding of these specific kind of interim targets and how to achieve them. So we can test empirically things that otherwise would take forever, and activists don't often want to do that kind of work. It's better if academics do it in a way, but obviously you don't have to choose either or. You can do both. So that's basically my talk, and I'd love to hear you guys' opinion and questions.
What about the compatibility of these different spectrums and ways of approach?
you'll have groups or individuals who believe in certain things, but the social movement itself tends to be diverse. And actually, it's quite useful to be diverse. There was a case in the UK which was against the third runway at Heathrow. It was basically causing all sorts of problems for different people for different reasons, right? Locally, it was literally going to destroy certain communities. They would have to be moved somewhere else to build this third runway there. The noise pollution, which doesn't sound like a big problem, but probably is if it's constant, was affecting other local people. And the big thing that changed that movement completely, because they've been having that fight for 20 years, but the big thing that changed it was getting the climate change activists to care about that issue. Because obviously, if you expand the airport there, you're going to increase emissions. So what happened there was one guy, he became a leader of the local group, and he had grown out of a movement that was looking at anti-roads work previously. And he basically did the same thing he did there. And that one was completely effective in terms of London roads. All of the London road proposals got cancelled. And it depended on the local groups in terms of the national road development scheme. But it was, on the whole, quite effective. And this one guy basically just used a strategy. He's not particularly intelligent. He is, but not in such a grandiose way. He's not particularly eloquent, but he knew what he was doing. And what he did was he basically got local groups to fight on their terms, right? So the local groups, they didn't care about climate change. They cared about the local issue. Most of them were older people that didn't even believe in climate change. So they did their own thing, and most of that was kind of lobbying efforts. The climate change groups came in, and they were all about disruption. I don't know if you guys know about Climate Camp. They were a group that was basically a group of people that likes doing direct actions. And they just, every year they took over a place for a week or two, and they did actions from there, and it became big news, and they got a lot of coverage for doing that, which has other reasons, not just the direct action elements. But they were able to get a huge amount of coverage for that in the press, and they were also able to kind of use the threat of disruption, because they actually had openly discussed that their plan wasn't to stop the airport from going. Obviously, it's a major airport. It's massive, Heathrow. And they could have easily stopped all air traffic just by having one person go on the tracks, because obviously there's like a terror threat. But they openly said two things. They said, we're not planning on doing that. We don't want to be disruptive, because the point isn't to disrupt people. That's not our goal. These people have flights to take. They're going to visit family. We don't want people to not be on our side because we're disrupting them. But they also said, look, it's an open process, and we make decisions on the day of, and we can't say who's going to show up, and we don't know what's going to happen, so we can't guarantee you we're not going to do anything. But we're not really trying to do something, right? So you had that disruptive element built in, but you had a large kind of consensus in the core group that it wasn't going to happen. So that was, and that worked the same way in the anti-roads movement. So you had really, and this wasn't even a movement in a way it was a kind of a campaign, because it was a campaign against one certain thing. But it took elements of all of these different things, working completely different strategies, and no group said, okay, you guys all have to be consensus-based, or you guys all have to be this one thing. Each group did its own thing. So the climate camp, they were all kind of consensus or direct democracy. They tried to minimize hierarchy. They were prefigurative, so they didn't use kind of high carbon emissions during their things. And they used it as a way to show, actually, look, we can live here for without using any emissions effectively. So they did that thing, and the local protesters were like, what's going on here? We don't like these people, but we'll deal with them and do our own thing. And eventually they actually ended up working together because Climate Camp actively tried to kind of build bridges between the two. But in essence, you don't necessarily have to. You could just say, look, we're going to do our own thing. And that can be effective because you got, on the one hand, all of these people lobbying, and on the other hand saying, well, if you don't give us what we want, there's these radical protesters that can disrupt everything, so you might as well do it, right? And it's called the radical flank effect. When you have kind of a branch of the movement, which you don't know what they're going to do. They're going to be disruptive, and they might threaten certain things. So why don't you just give us our demands before you have to face them, right? So it's certainly an approach that works. I mean, I think it's actually better if you mix the different strategies. One of the reasons is you don't know the context and how the context is going to play out. There's no law around this. So. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
How to deal with finding resources for managing the organization and the movement to go on, not to stop, and to find finances and so on. And the question then
Right.
about are we still communists and not to fall down to the interest of some larger capital.
Yeah. I think this actually, these are the tough questions. It's this and trying to get really involved in politics and the ideas of compromise around politics. And this is the hardest work that we have to do. This is the really radical challenge, is to stay radical while still participating in the system to the extent that it does what we want it to do, right? So there's always that challenge, right, of how do you get money and not succumb to the temptations of just changing your politics or whatnot. Again, it's hard to give direct answers to like a broad variety of things, but the context certainly matters, and the individuals matter and the structure matters. I think when you move away from democratic structures, there's a threat that the leadership can become transformed and more conservative and less political as it gains money and realizes that actually we can get more money and build the organization if we stop doing these things. I think the UK student unions in general, the student unions are relatively strong financially, and they have some say over university policy to some extent, but they've become apolitical. And part of it is, I think part of it is about these problems of, okay, you've become institutionalized, so now you act like you don't really care about those radical politics anymore. And the other thing is that radical people have stopped engaging with the political systems, the machines. I think we often are scared of compromise. It bothers us, and there's understandable reasons why. You don't want to make a tough decision and then fuck up. But I think that's the most radical thing that we can do. It's the thing that is the hardest to do, and it takes the most kind of courage, is to engage with this, maintain our radicalism, but become effective and really kind of milk the things, certain financial institutions or whatever, any body that can give us money or give us certain outcomes that we want without becoming what they want us to become. And we can see the same thing with political parties. It's really the tough thing to do, but it's what we have to do. And part of that is instead of just looking internally and building up our own political dynamic, going out and doing those other things and finding ways in which we stay radical. So checking ourselves about, okay, we're doing it, we want to compromise in certain ways that gives us the advantages that we want, but make sure that we're still following the path to our alternative and not just leaving it aside for a career or whatever it is. So it's the same way I approach academia. And to be honest, there's huge temptation to just become an academic. Just do the work you want, read interesting books, talk to students. You don't have to do anything else with your life. It's great. It's one of those things. And a lot of academics go in and they say, I want to change the world. And they find a hard time doing that and they just give up. And this is a struggle that we kind of all face in one way or another, of giving up. And it's compromise in life. So we might as well do it in the political system. So the way that I come into academia is seeing it as a means to an end, actually, as part of this path to the alternative. I do believe in an alternative. I don't know what it's going to look like. But I believe that we can move significantly in that direction if we really want to. By building the movement, by winning certain non-reformist reforms and things like that. And I see part of my work within academia as it could be helpful for that. But also it's like you get more time than other people to do activist work if you want to do that. So you can consider these things. And there's no real way of exiting the system, really, because you're feeding off of capitalism even if you're eating from a garbage can. So we have to kind of figure out what kind of compromise we want to make and still stay radical.
So what you said in the last 10 minutes is basically that in a successful movement, what it really comes down to is the particular individual emotional or other dedication to the actual cause. Isn't that a dangerous thing to rely on?
Indeed. Indeed. The problem is, it's kind of like the sociology, psychology debate, right? What are you focusing on? But it's not removing the social element from it. I mean, I think that we've seen a social change in the way the movements operate. And I'm not saying that movements before us didn't care, or did care, any more or less than we do, necessarily. But I think that the way we're perceiving care could be different, where we're caring about an alternative versus caring about dogma, lifestyleism, these other things. And those existed always, and it's always going to exist. But I think we're moving more and more in that direction. And I think that there are social forces behind that. I don't think it's just caring, because I think that or these kind of psychological things only. I think that it's a lot about how we practice that. But I think that part of it is rooted in actually wanting to achieve something. And that's really the point. I think we're seeing us go in a different direction because we've stopped caring in the same way. We've stopped caring about an alternative. We've stopped seeing a real alternative. Or at least that's becoming more and more of a threat to our movements. And more helpful for neoliberalism, really. Because it doesn't want to see an alternative. If even we can't see it, as the radical left, if we can't see an alternative, then basically they've already won. So we got to figure out something. I think Paracon is worth looking into. I think there are lots of things that we can do. And I definitely have a lot of hope. And I'd say mostly the negative stuff that I feel. But there's a lot of good. And I think that most of us probably aren't in these extreme versions of like lifestyleism and dogma and these things. So it's not like it's all bad. I just think that there's more and more elements of this happening because of social and economic consequences. experiences in this collective cognitive dissonance that we're experiencing. Yeah.
So let's say you have this academic fellow who really enjoys reading the books and giving lectures and talking to students, but not so much, he's not into this activist thing.
Right.
Well, how do you get him to say, go on strike, or occupy a faculty, or whatever? Do you have any recommendations? Because this is basically what we could really use.
Okay. Now we're getting to the nitty-gritty stuff. Okay. Well, part of it is, I think it tends to be framing to some degree. How are we framing what a strike is? Often, the left, the radical left, we want to frame a strike as, we can see it as a lifestyle thing, part of it, right? We've always done strikes, so let's participate in a strike. Why wouldn't you, right? Other ways, it's something that's radical, right? We can frame it as something radical. This is the extreme action we need to take to do something. I think the way you frame, and this goes beyond any particular action, but bringing people into a movement or bringing people into an action, things like that. The framing matters. So often, radical leftists will go to a protest that's put on by what we perceive to be like a more moderate organization. And that moderate organization may be framing concepts in a way that we don't like. And we can see that some of it is quite negative. There may be nationalistic elements to it and certain things like that. But we also have to think about how the people that we want to come into the movement perceive this frame. And if they come into the movement and perceive the frame as something positive, then we can at least bring them in and then show them maybe over time how there's problems with it and there's actually a much more strong critique to it. I actually started my political career, or whatever, my activist years. I wasn't particularly radical. I didn't grow up in a radical family. I did certain political things without knowing that they were political at a young age. And I think often people do this and then look back on it and say, yeah, I was always political. But it was never really radical. It's something you learn. And it's something you learn one way or another. And the way that I learned it was I became interested in politics in high school with a very good teacher who, he was a progressive, but I think he was more radical. He said he was a progressive. And what I did then is, after high school, I joined a group called Progressive Alliance, because I thought it was progressive. It was actually quite radical. And it taught me a lot about how reformism can't really work in certain elements, right? And things like that. So I would have never gone to an organization that said it was an anarchist organization. So, you know, in some ways you can see that they're being kind of deceiving, but it's not really the case, because in a way, if you're on the radical left, you're also progressive, as well as being on the radical left. You know, I mean, we believe in this. It's not like it's opposing things. So we have to figure out these frames that resonate with people to bring them in, if you're talking about bringing them in. And obviously for strike purposes, all you really have to do is bring them in. You don't even necessarily have to convert them to your ideas. You just need them to vote yes on a ballot or whatever, or participate in the strike if there's one already happening. Of course, it's going to depend on different situations. People fear losing their job sometimes if they strike, or looked at differently within their establishment. And a lot of that has to do with things like their peers. How are their peers going to perceive them? Do they feel like people are going to have their back that matter to them? And again, it's specific to who you're talking about. What is stopping them from participating? And basically what you want to do is just reduce the threats to them participating, whatever that may be. Whether it's the way that they're perceiving what a strike is, or whether it's the material realities of participating in a strike. So you could say, look, I can't, you know, if we really want this guy, maybe he's kind of holds a lot of sway in the department. We want him to participate, he's worried about losing whatever the amount of money he would lose for that day of work. We say, look, we'll start a fund for you, we'll give you that amount of money. Because if you can get him to bring 3 more people in, then it might be well worth that amount of money if you can raise it. But of course, it's even, you know, sometimes suggesting that you would even go out of your way to do something like that could bring people in, because they show that you actually care. You actually care about them and their position and what they want, and not just about this strike or what it means to you. So kind of reaching people at their level.
You have like an example of good practice.
So framing, if you talk about a strike as, you know, there's a reason that unions still use strikes. It's because at some level they are effective. And often people like to know that. And if you can show to them, if you do some research, and show to them that strikes can be effective, it's obviously going to help them see the benefits of doing it. So you can frame it in a way of it's actually effective, and show them some empirical research that you can find. That could work as a specific. But again, it depends on the person that you're trying.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When would you say, or if, any time, violence is justifiable as an element of activism?
Okay.
Since usually, when there is violence, there's more media coverage.
Yeah. So part of it is about how we're defining violence.
Violence or vandalism.
Right. So in the UK, often, like, if you disrupt something to the point where you vandalize, it could be called violence and accepted that way by the general public. So the context is going to matter there. If you have a public that is against property destruction, more so than, and see it as violence, it's going to be worse to do it. But you don't necessarily have the correlation of our support for the movement is the same as our support for what the movement is trying to do. So in the case of the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, you did see a correlation, which doesn't imply causation, as we all know, that as the public opinion against the war increased, the public opinion against protesters also increased. So people didn't like the protesters, but they were agreeing with the protesters more and more. And so, in some ways, getting into the media, even if you're perceived negatively, could be worthwhile. Whether you're actually being violent against a person may change the situation, because often the Vietnam War protests didn't, there were battles between the police and the protesters. But it wasn't like people were going out and beating other people up, things like that. So, in some ways, it can be justified when you're talking about starting some disruptive action or vandalizing. It does get more media coverage, like you're saying. Part of that reason is we have a lot of protests. We have a lot of permitted protests that don't cause disruption. So the media is kind of sick of it. And this is true in more left media as well, because they tended before to cover more protests. And so people kind of get used to it, and obviously the media works with sensationalism, so they want something new and exciting. I think in certain times, violence can be worthwhile. I think the means, are worth the ends. But it's very, very limited cases where you can imagine that. So we have to consider the context. And we should never, I don't think we should think about things as we should always stick to certain means, because the ends are different. The result of not doing something can be much worse than the result of doing something. So the moral equation there is kind of, we don't want to avoid purity. We don't want to just not do the bad thing. We want to increase as much the overall good outcome. So sometimes it takes bad things to get the good outcome. And obviously we never know what the outcome is really going to be. You know, hypothetical, it could have been worse if we killed off Hitler or something. Right? Could be. We don't know. We'll never know. But you kind of have to explore the argument and not just take a fundamental line either way.
As a means of affecting public opinion,
Yeah.
you would say that would you say that the most effective way of doing so is using empirical data as an argument? I mean, because it seems, at least to me, that the process is slippery slope. Empirical data can be misleading, statistical data can be misguiding, and can also lead to utilitarian.
Sure. I think it depends on what you want to achieve.
Yeah.
And I think, so if it's this one small goal, that it becomes particularly useful, then you can use it. I mean, the utilitarianism is there. They're using statistics against you. So you should use statistics against them, not saying that statistics is actually, should be what's justifying certain things, right? But we can use it to show that they're wrong. And I think that it helps a certain frame, but I don't think that it's the only frame that we can use. I think, there's the saying, lies, damn lies, and statistics. I think you can use statistics in a wide variety of ways. In that sense, that means you can always find statistics that are good for you, I suppose. But it does help certain people who are critical of our position. And, I think, trying to base your decision on factual matters isn't a bad position to take. So using empirical evidence seems reasonable to me. But it depends. I don't think that's going to help us achieve the overall goal, but I think interim goals, it makes sense. Yeah. But it's also other forms of framing issues. We put a lot of kind of radical slogans often in protests that we have. That can be good for increasing the threat of disruption, perhaps, in authorities, right? They understand what that means. On the other hand, if you're trying to have that protest be one that's building a movement, and you want more and more people to come, and you want to build links with people from outside the movement, then it's probably useful to avoid things like that and to have more moderate slogans, even if your politics are quite radical, because it's serving the means to your radical end. We're all good? All right, well, I'll be around, so if you guys have any questions you want to ask me individually, feel free. Thank you very much, Mia, for setting all of this up. I appreciate it. Thank you.